Hello there, this is Fiona, host and main GM for What Am I Rolling, a twice monthly RPG one-shot podcast. This is a bonus Q&A episode to tide us over to the next one-shot, and it is indeed a very special Q&A, as this week I had the absolute pleasure of interviewing Craig Duffy of LunarShadow Designs, a UK designer and tabletop enthusiast who publishes games with a focus on science fiction space operas and Cold War espionage. A number of Craig's work takes place in the Dyson Eclipse, a space opera setting that tells one story at a time through a series of interconnected games and adventures. Craig's latest in-development game for the Dyson Eclipse setting is Hopes and Dreams of the Orbital Bound, a slice-of-life RPG about the everyday citizens of Tau Ceti and their lives aboard the gigantic alien habitats. It was an absolute delight to interview Craig about his work. I'm a massive fan, as you know, about using different RPG systems to tell different stories, and having a setting that connects them all feels very exciting and unique. You can find out more about Craig's work and grab your own copy of any of his games on his website, lunarshadow.net. I'll put all the relevant links to Craig's work in this episode's show notes. All right, brilliant. So we're just going to start off nice and simple. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Who are you and what do you do?
So I'm Craig Duffy. I'm a UK-based indie game designer, writer, publisher, layout. I'm one of these people that I can't afford to get other people to do it for me, so I've had to wear every single hat, which is surprisingly common in this scene.
So how did you get into role-playing games? What's your sort of origin story?
So didn't start role-playing games till quite late, till I was doing my PhD. So I'd already been to uni once and again. I'd always been on the periphery.
Yeah.
And then I finally took the plunge during probably the busiest 5 years of my life.
Yeah, I was going to say PhD. Yeah, I was going to say PhDs are quite an intense thing. So
yeah, but it was a way to just forget about my research and dive into stories. I've always been on the periphery. I was a war gamer. I've LARPed. I did free-form play-by posts all before I'd got into actual played a single session with dice.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
So I think it was just a natural progression.
For you, then, obviously, then playing RPGs to going then to designing your own RPGs, what was like the step between that two processes? Because sometimes people just obviously get into just being players and that's all they are, and then sometimes transition to game master stuff. But you sort of went, and I've created, up until this point at the time of recording, like 4 very different RPGs.
Well, I mean, within a year of starting, I was GMing my own games. And then it was just always just telling the stories. And then somebody said we played Lady Blackbird, which is a fantastic example of game design. One of my friends went, oh, but how would you tailor it to do, I think it was Warhammer 40,000, which is totally different thematically.
Two very different vibes.
And I spent the next month just tweaking it. And I mean, from there I was hooked, sort of, really. And then it was just a case of going, well, if I do this, I can do this. And if I do that, I can do this. And before I knew it, I had a completely different game. It was absolute rubbish. It never saw the light of day. But I think I was just hooked from there.
What kind of genres and of stories do you like to tell or play in?
Mostly modern sci-fi, sort of that sort of genre. But I like everyday people. I don't like people that... You've got the typical D&D party where once you get past a certain level, your average villager cannot do anything to you. Because, you know, a level 10 character is not threatened by a farmer with a pitchfork. I hate that. I want a bit more realism. So, yeah, very, very realistic with big quote marks. Down to earth is better. That sort of game. And I love sci-fi. I always have. So big explosions, big technology, and just big space stations. I love the scale you can get with sci-fi. I think you can have a fantasy world, but sci-fi, you can have 10 dozen fantasy worlds.
And they're all so different as well. Like, you can all have different versions of it, different alternate timelines and realities, which I know is covered on a little bit in some of your RPGs. And I agree. I think this, for me as well, because I'm an improviser as well, and we're always talking about, like, the most important thing in a scene or an improv scene is actually the relationship between the 2 or 3 people in the scene, rather than necessarily, like, the suggestion you might get of airport or something like that. And I think what I liked about when I was reading your games was that, you focus on the sort of slice of life or the mundane, but in the extraordinary circumstances of, like, it's in space, it's on these big habitats and all that sort of thing. Do the characters change a lot as a result? And I feel like obviously there's certain things that will change about their everyday life, but at the same time, I think you give an example in your latest RPG was like they're arguing with their parents on the way to the airlock, and it's like, that's something we could absolutely identify with and relate to. It just happens to be in an extraordinary environment.
Yeah, I mean, so that's Hopes and Dreams of the Orbital Bound, and that was very much inspired by the books of Becky Chambers.
Oh, yes.
Who is a fantastic author. She puts such a spin that you don't get in most sci-fi, because it is about the people. And it's about they're living on space stations or going down to worlds with completely different environments, and it's perfectly normal to them. You're reading it and going, wow, what about this? And then it's like, oh yeah, and then I just went and got some food. Because it's their everyday life, and that's the sort of stuff I like exploring.
I will say, like, her first book, A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, was one of them. It got me back into reading sci-fi after a long time. I had a very similar experience, no PhD, unfortunately, but at university, where I just didn't read for leisure for such a long time. And my mother, who will be listening to this, and she'll be very happy that I've mentioned her in this anecdote, she got me this book, the Becky Chambers, A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, and she was like, oh, you like sci-fi, you heard about it, and I devoured it because it was such a good book of stuff that nothing really happens in it other than they go from A to B, and then an event happens at the end. But then all the characters, they feel so real and they're so different. It's what I like to call, like, Doctor Who aliens as they're meant to be. Like, they're so wildly different, but they still connect on a level. And it was so magical to read it through. It felt to me like stuff like, like when you think of, like, Firefly or Serenity, that sort of level of the relationships and stuff like that. And I was going to ask if that was one of the inspirations for Orbital Bound, because I was like, I definitely feel I've read this or something similar materials to it.
Yeah, so it was the third book, which typically I'm blanking on the name of right now. Records of a Spaceborne Few. And I have to admit that book had me in tears the first time I read it, because there's one character's storyline that just... I got to one chapter and I did not see what was about to happen coming. And I just had to put the book down. It was that good.
Yeah.
And you don't get that often where you get a book, it's so good you put it down and stop reading because you can't progress.
You'll have to remind me, is that the one where they're stuck on the planet because all the satellites have gone down so no one can leave and stuff? Is that the one I'm thinking of?
No, so that's the fourth book. So it's the third one where it's the human settlements on their original generation fleet that's now broken and decaying and falling apart. And it's all about people finding their place in this civilization, really. So you've got a character that's come from another planet whose ancestors were on the ships. You've got a teenager that's just finding what job does he want to do and what does he actually believe in. And you've got the older generation that are wary, that have seen it all. And it's about how they all interact in light of some actually pretty mundane events.
Well, let's talk about Hopes and Dreams of the Orbital Bound then. So for those people who aren't aware of it, what is this game and what makes it stand out from other RPGs out there, certainly other sci-fi RPGs out there?
So Hopes and Dreams of the Orbital Bound is slice of life sci-fi about ordinary people living on gigantic alien space stations that we would consider fantastical, but it's just their everyday lives. And it's about their interactions. And I sort of wrote it as sort of like a counterpoint to standard big adventure sci-fi, with the idea of maybe you're playing this big adventure and then you get to the end and you cut away to the everyday people and play a session or two of their lives and then go back to the big adventure to ground your reality almost. So I think a good way of thinking about it, Deep Space Nine. So the big adventure is your core cast, Cisco, Dax, Kira, and then Orbital Bound is Keiko, Rom, Leela, all the background characters that are caught up in everything that's going on, but just trying to get through an ordinary day.
Yeah, a little bit of lower decks in there as well, that idea. We're not focusing on the main cast and stuff. Yeah. The one thing that struck to me is that it is a rotating GM game as well, which again is quite rare. We have, obviously if we have like just one GM or no GM, but this one in Hopes and Dreams is that you, after each scene, it passes over to another GM who would like to see a scene and sort of set things up. And that, for me, I love that as an idea. It means that rather than people just jumping in whenever, and some people might not jump in as much or whatever, you have the next scene. What scene would you like to see? And put your own character in it, or put other characters from this pool, the shared pool of characters. What was the inspiration behind that particularly? Or like, how did you came across that sort of idea of structure?
I'm going to fully admit here, I stole that. A lot of the inspiration for the mechanics of the game come from Remember Tomorrow, which is a small cyberpunk game published by Gregor Hutton, who's a genius Scottish game designer that also wrote 316, Carnage Amongst the Stars, and has contributed to games like A-State. And a lot of the mechanics were lifted from that because it was just very much, again, if you're in control of what your character is encountering, it gets a bit boring. You always know what you're going to come up against. Whereas you turn to the person on the left and say, right, what happens next? What do I see now? They can introduce those sort of twists that you're never going to see coming.
Yeah, for what somebody else sees for your character, or sees something that you might not see. You might not see the obvious twist or something like that, or something completely different. So I really like that as a way of improvised storytelling. And as long as people are consenting to it, it's fine. But yeah, this idea of the shared pool of characters as well, it made me think of like Cloud Atlas in a way. The idea that the same people, perhaps the players, are playing different characters throughout, and it's just different storylines that are sort of maybe tied together or maybe related to one another.
Yeah.
And again, like you said, like looking at these sort of side characters or the sort of the mundane plot, perhaps, like that doesn't necessarily impact the like you said, the sort of the main plot, the main characters off doing stuff, but what happens there impacts on them. And I like that idea that you could do that within the system. Like things happen outside and you can still see snippets of it, of the world changing around it. And it's just, I find that really fascinating to play. And like, what does this mean? Because you, the player, could realize like there are certain big elements happening, but then your characters might not, or might not care, or and it was just an interesting way of telling a different story.
I believe in having the right system for the right story. So that idea of let's play the same campaign with two different systems that we cut back and forth really appeals to me, because I don't think we do it enough. I think we use one system and try and tell too many stories sometimes.
Oh yeah, 100%.
And I'm very much, and not just because I write small games, but I like switching things up, taking different games, different systems, and going, right, this mechanic helps you tell this sort of story. So let's use that, maybe only for a session, maybe for 10 minutes while you wait for the last person to arrive. It brings a bit more life to things and lets you change the pace up a lot, rather than just the same mechanic, the same pacing. You do something a bit different.
I hadn't really even considered that. Yeah, you could be telling this overarching campaign and then have different systems for different stories that happen with it. And then, like you said, like, okay, this session, we are going to focus on the back home, what is happening. We're using this system. I like that because, as someone who obviously promotes and tries to get people into other games that aren't the big ones, I really like that because obviously, and I'm sure you're on the same page with this as well, like when you use different systems to tell different stories, you become a better storyteller and maybe just more aware of, like, other opportunities rather than just using the same system to then shoehorn all these other stories, your horror, your sci-fi. And it's maybe easier in terms of like accessibility. If one person knows the system very well, then then it's easy for them. But at the same time, if you get out of your comfort zone and learn other systems, which isn't that hard realistically, like obviously depending on the crunchiness of a system, like if you're willing to learn, that's half the battle, I find. So I find it's interesting in that front.
Even in D&D, where you often do get people saying, oh, we can just use the same system, there's loads of indie creators that have created interesting subsystems. I mean, there's a whole genre of D&D subsystems for cozy gaming.
Yeah,
they've tacked on those extra mechanics that just tweak it towards what they want to be playing. So why not go the whole hog and do an entirely separate game for when you're at the tavern and you're trying to see which member of the party can drink the most.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It could literally, it could be as literally as micro as that. Like I've seen there are like cards and stuff like prompts. So like if you're having like downtime and you're doing like little mini vignettes around, getting ready for bed and stuff like that, having cards to be like, what's your character thinking right now? And asking questions of backstory and stuff. Again, a way to, in the calm before the storm of like two big events, you can give that backstory and stuff. Another interesting point of Hopes and Dreams of the Orbital Bound, it's part of the setting, the Dyson Eclipse setting, which you also had another game that's sort of based in it as well, the Signal to Noise. I was wondering if you could talk about that game particularly, as well as like, why did you come up with this sort of setting overall, which obviously now 2 different game systems are in?
So I'm actually up to 3 game systems already. So Rock Hoppers is a solo game based on The Wretched that's also in the same setting.
Right. Oh, great.
So again, it's just been a lover of sci-fi and wanting the feeling of a bigger world. So the Dyson Eclipse is my space opera setting that I'm slowly developing, but each game tells a different part of the story from a different angle. So Signal to Noise kicks it all off, and it's a 2-player bittersweet duet game where humanity has discovered these alien superstructures in orbit around Tau Ceti, but they don't have faster than light travel, so they're sending a generation ship. One character gets picked to go, the other stays behind on Earth, and it's all about trying to maintain the relationship, the connection between them as the spacer gets further and further away. The lag between the messages gets longer and longer, and errors slowly introduce into the messages. And it's really bittersweet and emotional because at the start, at some point, you're going to lose contact. There's no way around that. It's an inevitability. It's very much, I wrote it during lockdown when I was stuck at home, spending probably 15 hours a day on the computer. Everyone felt so far away, and it was like that. What do I do with my emotions? I'll put them into a game.
I know where they'll go.
Yeah.
I like what you said, like, now that you've got 3 different ways, and again, it goes back to what you were saying before about like having a campaign system, but then having those different mechanics in it to tell different stories, again, makes me think of, like, as you said, space opera. I know obviously Star Wars is the big one, but now we have so many different Star Wars in terms of, like, got the main movies, but also then you've got, Acolytes just come out. You've got Rogue One as Andor. I was going to say Rogue One, the series for Rogue One, Andor, which is great. The Mandalorian, and because they tell different stories of the different characters and stuff. And so, I love that idea of having like an overall setting where it appeals to lots of people, like you said, that people who want to do just duet games or people who are wanting to play a different kind of sci-fi game. And what struck me particularly about Signals to Noise was that, again, like, I love the idea of like letter writing and that sort of thing. I think that's always a really powerful thing to do. But actually, it was the first game I'd seen. Okay, ideally it should be done through text, because that is one kind of gaming, and like play by text, play by post, etc. But then you also gave examples of like how would you do this as like an audio or a video like message, and I really like that idea because as someone who obviously creates RPG content, and also like, well, how can we do this as a stream? How can we do this as an audio? And I just thought, because you added some like a particular like rules in terms of distortions, like how would you do this? And if your players are very good at like editing, here's how they would introduce the distortions. Is it fade to black? Is it adding some static noises? And how much would it do? And I very much appreciated that as a prompt, as a thing to make you go, yeah, why wouldn't you do that? So as like someone who does like improv, it was like a exercise I put together. It's similar to like that idea of letter writing, where someone would sit in a chair and the other person would stand behind the chair but with the back to them. And the person writing the letter would keep it short for the sake of people's memories, but would write a letter to them, and then the person would have to respond to what they heard, and they would never be able to see each other. It was only one at a time. And it was very powerful because we got some very intense, sometimes amusing back and forth, but at the same time, it really focused on the emotion because you can't instantly respond. And again, like you said, with Signal to Noise, that idea of like the connection growing further and further, and then distorting, and then at the end, connection lost.
Yeah.
You have got a valuable amount of time to write these things and say these words out loud.
So there's a table in the book that says each round how long it takes for the messages to be received, and that's literally just physics of how long does light take to travel a given distance.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually, on one of the early drafts, I had someone respond and say, do I have to wait 5 years before I send my next message? And that's actually, anyone that commits to that, I'm on board. Someone that's willing to wait.
That's definitely a way to play it, yeah.
5 years to send the next message to someone that they see down the pub every week.
Mm-hmm.
I absolutely love that. Again, it comes back to the right mechanics for the right story.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of going back to what you're saying about Star Wars, I have to admit the Star Wars novels, as a teenager, I was a massive nerd. And there was this Star Wars expanded universe where they had this giant universe and different series of books told very different stories.
Mm-hmm.
You had your books about the Jedi. You had your books about the everyday pilots and the smugglers. So again, that's a big influence on my approach to sci-fi.
Same with high fantasy. You get that sort of thing. When you think of high fantasy, you're like, oh yes, Dungeons and Dragons. Sci-fi, you're like, oh yes, big ships, big battles, all that sort of thing. And it is sort of nice to have that step back and be like, we can have it. I know I've said it several times in interviews recently, but that idea of a veil over the top of it, so that there is a sci-fi, but it's over the veil of mundane life. That things are the same, but slightly different. And yeah, it's just a nice way of looking at it and still have. There's no better way I can think of putting it, but like having the emotions there, having that able to relate to someone there with that experiences, without it feeling like, oh, I would never connect with something like that, or that doesn't relate to me because it's in the future, quotation was on these big habitats, and it's like, well, no, because like it's not that much different. Like being in the future is not that much different. So
I mean, people are still going to be people unless you're going to go down the radical alterations or the very alien approach. Mm-hmm. And at the moment, there are no aliens in the setting as I'm writing it. I put a big asterisk there because I don't know how the story's developing. I'm doing it. I've got ideas, but aliens might show up. They might not. It depends on how things go over ask me in 5 years what I've managed to develop. Where it gets to.
I'll put a notification on, but like message Craig in 5 years, like, hi Craig, remember this? Again, as with all things I'm very big fan of in role-playing games and storytelling, is that it is like a living document. And normally we say that because or a living book, and then normally we say that is because, the players will have an impact and change things, which is absolutely true. But also it allows you to be like, in 2 years' time go, oh, actually, yes, there are aliens, or there were aliens, but they've disappeared for whatever reason. And it allows you to not be like, stuck with just that. It's so nice because that means you can expand that. And as you said, like if you're creating even more game systems for this particular setting, you want to keep that freedom and that flexibility open as well. So I very much appreciate it. And there could be right now, who knows? And that's okay. Yeah. I'm very happy to find out.
I mean, at the moment, I've got a document that is my canon, and that's from playing through the games and how a particular playthrough came out. But in terms of the actual prompts, someone could get prompts that I never got and take a very drastically different approach and result. And actually, it's a little challenging to make sure they could all merge back in some ways. So that's something I'm definitely going to have to be careful of in the future, just to make sure that if I do say something that contradicts what I've done in an earlier game, it makes sense.
Yeah.
That someone doesn't play one game and then go, oh, I can't play this because something else happened in my game.
Trying to work out like the backwards compatibility of stuff, perhaps in terms of lore. Interesting. So like you said, so it's sort of like lo-fi sci-fi sort of everyday thing is sort of one like tent pole in your games. Yeah. Then the other genre that you very kindly sent over to me, Project Cassandra and Number Stations, is to do with sort of spy and sort of alternate histories. What interests you about like historical RPGs and writing games based or set in sort of previous timelines or alternate timelines?
I'm a little bit of a Cold War nerd, primarily from growing up at the end of the 80s. One of the first major world events I remember is the fall of the Berlin Wall. So the very end of the classic concept of the Cold War. I also grew up in a military family. So as a kid, I was on base regularly. So it was normal for me to see soldiers going around with guns and planes overhead. So it's that sort of, I saw the tail end of it. What did I miss? And then started reading into it, and Project Cassandra it's a game about psychics during the height of the Cold War. And it's actually inspired by the real CIA experiments.
Yeah.
MK Ultra is the most famous of them. And it was a case of, well, what if they had succeeded? What would have happened then?
Mm-hmm.
What would psychic spies do? And did they save the world and we just never knew about it?
Mm.
And then Number Stations is actually very close to real world. So that's all about a solo spy, and it actually uses real number stations that are still going, spy transmissions that you can just listen to on the internet.
Yeah, that was wild. Again, not that you would know it from looking at me. I'm not necessarily the biggest history fan ever, but when I read through Number Stations, and you very kindly put a link to like where you can listen to them. Like I was trying to have not a playthrough per se, but like listen and see how I would play the game. And I was I love games. Which is obviously a massive kudos to you, obviously. But I love games that use something in the real world, which, again, you would either ignore or not notice at all. And I had never heard of Number Station before, so having a quick deep dive on that, and that is fascinating that this is still used. And even though, as you said, like, encryption has gone on, it's leaps and bounds, obviously we've got the internet and stuff like that, but the fact this is still used somewhere, and you can listen in, and, like, what does this mean? It just felt so interesting to have a game that you could play at scheduled times, per se, listening into that. Like, again, as you said, it's like, obviously, it might not be on, it might be on at 3 a.m, but so there's alternate ways to play, which I very much appreciate for that in terms of accessibility. But I love the idea of like, well, I want to listen to Into the Station now and play right now, because it makes me feel immersed in the story. And the same thing with Project Cassandra as well. I liked how you talked about it, like this was a real thing. Like you do a little bit of like sort of a history primer, which I'm very much appreciative of, because sometimes games don't necessarily acknowledge that per se, or don't go into like a good summary of it. So you're like, this is a thing that happened, but what if, like you said, what if it was real and we just don't know that it happened? And I just really like that alternate history, alternate now about like, what if this was the case? And it just makes it feel so real and immersive.
The Cold War is one of these genres I don't think there is as much as there could be, because it spanned so long and it was very vague in a lot of senses that we don't have as much of a collective consciousness of it. Like the same way we have World War II. Everyone knows the basics of World War II, but we don't have that for the Cold War. And I should also say the idea of using the real number stations was my co-creator, Alberto Furlan. It was his idea, genius idea.
Yeah.
And he reached out to me and said, "You're into the Cold War. What do you make of this?" And I looked at the draft and the concept that he sent me and went, "I'm in." It was just the idea of immersing yourself. And as you say, these stations, they still used. The consensus is that they're mostly used by Russia. No one knows if they're actually being listened to by anyone, or are they just trying to fake out MI5 or the FBI or the CIA and have them dedicate resources trying to crack it. But the idea of immersing yourself into it and having to go, I can only play this game at this time of day. If I miss it, I have to wait another 6 hours before it transmits again. And the other thing is they're just really creepy.
Yeah, it was scary. I was like listening to one of them and I was like, I think I could hear someone. And then, trying to get the band right so I could listen to it. And it was very eerie. Yeah, because I put it on in the background and it wasn't, I was like, okay, I've got 10 minutes. And then suddenly I heard someone speaking to me. It was very scary. I loved it though.
I mean, there's a really famous station, I don't know if it's still broadcasting, that used to use a child's voice.
No way.
And it was a little girl just reciting numbers and then singing.
Oh, no.
And then reciting numbers.
That's horrific.
Can you imagine waiting till 1 a.m. to get the right broadcast channel and that comes over in the dark on your own?
I love it. I hate it. I absolutely love that. Wow, that's great. You've had several games now that you've been game designing over the last 5 or 6 years or so. What would you say is the most challenging part when it comes to game design for you specifically?
Getting people interested, getting the word out. So that's a bit of a cheat question because it's not about the design.
Well, you said before you're wearing lots of different hats and stuff like that. It is. I think it's part of your job as a solo creator is also to market the game. So I don't think it's cheating out at all. It is a big challenge, certainly nowadays.
It's something that every creator probably has to deal with, especially with the way social media in the last 12 months has just imploded in terms of reach, in terms of views and fragmentation. I don't think we appreciated how good Twitter was as like a central site until it just all went pigs up and we split to Mastodon, Blue Sky,
Threads. It's
Threads.
Can't keep up.
Yeah, so that's the biggest issue. And I was speaking to someone that does it full time back in December at Dragon Meet, and they said what a lot of people don't understand is you've got to treat it like a job. It can't just be the game design.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to do the marketing. You've got to do the reaching out to distributors. You've got to do your taxes. I hate my taxes, and I'm only doing it part time. I barely scrape over the threshold.
Mm-hmm.
I've probably got the simplest tax return ever, and I always leave it till like 2 weeks before the deadline.
That's an interesting point because, again, something that is maybe more unique about yourself is that you do publish your like the financials for your games as well. What's the reason behind that, if I may ask? Because it's interesting in a time where people are discussing like pay rates for like writers and stuff like that, and you're very willing to show like here's what I earned this year and here's what it cost me and stuff like that. Just out of interest, what was the motivation publishing that sort of information?
Partially because I wish I'd had it when I started, that I'd known, right, this is where you're going to spend your money. This is what you need to think of. When I did my first Kickstarter for Project Cassandra, I probably spent 2 months trying to work out a budget. What am I going to have to spend stuff on? And having that information, if someone had published it beforehand, would have been really useful to me. This was the second year of Zine Quest, so the idea of people like me, hobbyist publishers, running Kickstarters for £500 or that was really taking off. Mm-hmm. There was just so many of us that didn't know what we were doing. So I thought, well, I wanted it, so why not share it? The other big thing was that I talked to a lot of people getting into it, and they think, oh yeah, I've spent 3 years working away on this game. It's going to be an overnight success. And then it's not, or they scrape by. And I think and again, this is social media's fault partially. It's so easy to see the big successes and forget about the hundreds, thousands of people that are putting out stuff that's good, that maybe only gets 20 downloads. So I wanted to show just what the reality is. That, you know, I mean, I've got my numbers from last year. My income last year was just short of £6,000. Most of that I then spent on various expenses. And that's normal. That's what the vast majority of this hobby is supported by. There's, you know, we all see Wizards and Paizo, and even you know, Chaosium, a massive company by the standards of the hobby, but they're tiny by anything else. And if they're the big guys, what are the really tiny little fish doing?
There's a study out just now with Dr. Emily Friedman, sorry, and Carson Barnes. They did a big study about like just canvassing people in the tabletop industry about like, can you make a living in the tabletop industry if like a indie creator as an actual play person, etc. And obviously the answer roughly is no, because it is, like you said, people are just either scraping by, but it's not a living. It is just to usually put that money back into yourself or back into your products and stuff like that and keep going, because we're not got, like you said, we've not got these big budgets that like the Wizards has or Hasbro has or any of those things have. Yeah, I very much appreciate you sharing that sort of thing, because it is true. It's like, is this normal? And the answer is yes, it is. Here's what I have. What do you have? And just being honest about it rather than being secretive about it, being worried that people are going to judge you for it. Because no one's going to judge you because people don't know. And I think, and talking about money in general is always, I don't know, like certainly British people don't like talking about money for sure. Americans certainly do not bring it up in any sort of like pay rates and stuff like that. But I think just being able to just be honest about it, I think is a huge milestone in that sort of sense.
I don't want people to think, oh, I made £200, that's a failure, because if you get something out there, that's a success. That's what your metrics should be. It's obviously different if you've got a mortgage to pay off that.
Of course.
but you also need to be realistic. Again, I've talked to people at conventions that during lockdown had some success and then thought, I'll be able to continue this, and didn't necessarily have a plan or a backup.
Yeah.
I've always said I don't think I want to go full time, but if I could ever get to the point of doing part-time at my proper job and then 1 day a week, that would be living the dream, for want of a better phrase.
I agree with you in that sense. Like, I feel like for me, because I'm currently in between jobs, I've just moved countries and stuff like that, so taking my time to get myself settled here, and I would love to be able to do something part-time and then work on the podcast half-time and stuff like that, just to give myself that creativity, just to give myself that sort of be able to give back in certain ways and stuff like that, because like that would be just nice to do. And it's also like, I think I discovered, and again, I don't wish to assume anything about yourself as well, but like during the pandemic I was like, oh, I don't need to work at this horrible job. It pays money, but it's not creative and it's not fun, and I don't want to be doing this for the rest of my life. To the pandemic, obviously lots of things happened, but I was sort of aware that suddenly we can do lots of stuff online. We can do there's lots of different RPGs out there. We can do actual plays that are like all over the shop. And it's just like, you can do this, so why limit yourself to one thing? So that I agree with you. I think my dream would be able to like work on this part-time and have a job part-time. I don't know, the stress of doing game design full time, like, don't get me wrong, I as someone who doesn't design games at all, I would marvel at doing it, but it sounds very stressful. And like you said, like a lot of, I guess, you put yourself into these games, as you were saying, like you put yourself into a game, you work on it really hard, and if it's not successful, I can imagine people who maybe aren't as strong or resilient might feel the consequences back on them, which is not the case at all, you know.
Definitely. I know plenty of people that have done that or have just burned out.
Yeah.
They've done the hustle, not made it, and just quit games entirely. And it's like, again, it comes back to if you're going to do it as a job, you've got to treat it like a job.
Yes. Yeah.
And I want to treat it like a hobby.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I want it to be fun.
Yeah.
And it's the same at conventions. I've just come back from UK Games Expo last weekend, which is a massive event. Most of the people there are not doing it full time.
No.
Most of the people there are doing it as a hobby, doing it in their free hours and just pouring their energy into it. So being able to say, this is my line, this is how far I'll go, I think is really important.
Yeah, you got to have those boundaries and the set as well, because otherwise you said you just run yourself into the ground and burn out, and then there's not much for you there. Like afterwards, people I'm sure will pick you up and stuff, but you need to have those in just for your own safety. What is it about game design that you really love? What is something that brings you joy whenever you get to it as part of the game design process?
I mean, I love to just being able to tell stories and build something that tells those stories. Obviously GMing fills a lot of that for me. Yeah. But I like mechanics. I like there's the constant online argument about do systems matter? For me they do. So that going, I want to tell this story, how do I do it? It becomes it's like a logic puzzle to me. And it's the little things that I can be on the train and going, well, if I do this or that, how does that then affect how it feels, what the outcome is? And then for me, the big challenge is just getting it all down on paper. Oh, yeah. the tyranny of the blank page, which I'm sure everyone that's ever tried to write something knows about.
Yeah. It's like, why can't you just scan my brain and then just put it there? Yeah, no, I feel you on that front.
And then other thing that I've found I do enjoy actually is like the layout. I don't have any training in layout. I'm not going to say I'm Johan Noor with Morkborg and that genius that is on display there. Yeah. But there's something quite calming about moving things around and putting them in the right place and lining things up. So I do some university lecturing. My students hate whenever I give them a poster assignment because I pull them apart and go, well, that's a couple of millimeters out of place because there's just something in my brain that goes, that's a nice straight line. That's the right size text. That's positioned right. So I find layout quite a calming experience, actually.
As someone who looks through RPGs and like I sort of not pick them apart, but I sort of look at them in terms of accessibility and stuff for online stuff. I do find it interesting. Like you said, like some of the, like one thing I'll pick up on is like Cubicle 7, like starter sets. They're very pretty. There's lots of stuff, but then the rules themselves are integrated in the starter set scenario. And I'm like, but I want to just look at the rules separately, and now I've got to read the whole scenario and all that sort of thing. And then, like you said, like I think sometimes I see some beautiful books and I'm like, but there's a massive white space here at the bottom. What's that for? Could you put an image in? And so I do start to notice it a lot more now. The way that maybe it's the layout is put in slightly closer in, and you think, oh, is it going to be something in the columns, perhaps like a game designer's commentary, which is something obviously I love, but it's like there's also gaps here. so I always make a note of it. Morkborg is a very good example. Like obviously, as you said, Johan Noor's like art design is obviously it broke all the rules, it did set that sort of tone. It did so well. And then they released like the bare bones edition. It was like, okay, here's it without all the art, just to make it accessible. And the fact so you can easily look at this book without the art and stuff, but it makes it so interesting and different. It's a book you put on the coffee table and you go, look at this, look how different it is. And I very much appreciate how art and the layout can really make an RPG system shine. You say pick apart your students. I mean, I'm with you. If it's out of line, if it's like this could be a lot better if you really focused on it.
Well, I mean, it's basically things. PowerPoint, that horrible piece of software that
it's dreadful. Yeah,
we all have to use. I'll spend half an hour just teaching them how to use it. It's like, this is how you align stuff.
Yeah,
and it's that sort of basics, because I can't say whether everyone's like this. I look at something, and if it distracts me from what the message is.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
Accessibility is something that I think we still need to do a lot better on.
100%, yeah.
I know I can't necessarily do the most accessible core PDF. So I always try and include just a Word document or a plain PDF of the text. But also things like, how do we get maybe audio versions?
Yeah.
I know for a lot of people, reading is an issue. Do we do high contrast? So that's something that I'm conscious I need to improve on, but I think the hobby as a whole really needs to improve on.
Having an audio narration of core rulebooks, I think that's becoming more and more popular for sure. Whether or not big game companies are going to put money into it and actually get voiceover artists to do it, or if they're going to use AI to generate it, that's another problem from another day. But I agree, it would be something which I definitely would appreciate, because then I could listen to it whilst going for the walk, or taking out, doing chores around the house. I listen to podcasts. That's what I do, and listening to role-playing is, I would 100% be like, I'll put an audiobook on of my favourite RPG, and I'll be like, so that's how the rules work. It's just a different way of learning. And I think as long as you have a way to make the game accessible by one different means, whether it is, like you said, just a plain text document or audio, that's a means, at least that your game system is accessible by a different means. If you've got a video or an image and you don't put alt text on, and for whatever reason the video doesn't work or the link is broken, then at least you still have the alt text, or you have a little summary underneath the video, so you know what was in it, so that if you can't replace it quickly, that's it. All it is, just that little thing. And lots of people, certainly in education, I'm talking about education in general now, but yeah, I agree, in the RPG community, I think people still are catching up slowly. Yeah. The want is there, but it is a very slow process.
I mean, I think that's pretty much a summary of every way that the RPG scene needs to improve. Is we want to, and we're doing it slowly, but just not quite quickly enough.
Yeah. If someone was going to pick up one of your games, I appreciate, obviously they're all very different in terms of running them at different systems stuff, but if someone was picking one up for the first time, what big piece of advice would you give them for running it or facilitating one of your games?
That's a really difficult one, because they're all so different. I suppose make sure you've picked the right game up.
That's good, yeah.
Yeah, they are so different that the themes are different. So I think know what you're getting into would be in terms of running it. Mm-hmm. And certainly in general, compared to a lot of traditional games, when I do have a GM, I still want the players contributing, adding suggestions. Hopes and Dreams of the Orbital Bound does that a lot, because you've got the rotating GM, you've got people taking on minor characters. But that's actually part of the inspiration behind Project Cassandra, was to try and build a traditional style system that gave the players that option, because I wanted my players at the time to get into more indie games. So I thought I'll build something for them that gives them the illusion that I'm in charge, but actually ask them to do some of the work. I love
that. So yes, I built this just for you. Now, please contribute.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Craig, for joining me for this interview. Honestly, I really found it fascinating, and thank you so much. I really am interested in all these the different mechanics that you sort of came up with, or borrowed with credits rather than steal. The final sort of question is, where can we find your work? Is there any upcoming games or projects you'd like to talk about? Where can we find your stuff on the internet to find out more?
So I'm on DriveThruRPG and itch.io, both under LunarShadow Designs. I'm on Twitter and Blue Sky as Hoodoo Voodoo and just Hoodoo. I really need consistency across sites. In terms of new games, I've got two that I hope to release by the end of the year. The first is another letter writing two-player game, sci-fi game.
Nice.
Inspired by This Is How You Lose the Time War.
Oh, excellent. That's a great book. I really enjoyed that book.
Again, it's about two agents on opposite sides, but using text to manipulate history. So you're creating the history together, but you're also changing each other's history, which I think text is a great medium for. The second game that's in development, again with Alberto, is a follow-on from Number Stations to make it a two-player.
Nice.
So instead of just the spy, you've got the spy and the person giving them missions. Two different forms of communication, and they've each got their own objectives, trying to get the other to see things their way.
Ooh, I like that. Almost a little bit code names like, in a way. Like
that's
kind of.
Yeah.
not exactly like code names, but that's why it sort of came to my head. Oh, so nice.
Both of those early drafts at the moment, hopefully at least an ash can before the end of the year for them.
Nice. Brilliant. Oh, thank you so much, Craig. I very much appreciate your time, and best of luck with those games as well. They sound excellent.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's been a really nice chat.
I'm hoping to do more of these special Q&A bonus episodes in future, including Q&As on the one-shots we've run here at What Am I Rolling? If you have a question or think of an RPG designer you'd like to see interviewed on this podcast, just let us know. Our email address is whatamirollingpodcast@gmail.com. And that's it. Great. See you next time.